Now, the new atheism is a militant version of the atheism that has existed, of course, for centuries. Its leaders are Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Dan Dennett in England and North America, but it also has begun to go beyond the bounds of the English-speaking world to France in particular with Michel Onfray and his Atheist Manifesto. And the millions of books that have been sold show just how considerable the interest is. Sam Harris wrote this: "Tolerance of pervasive myth and superstition is not a virtue. Religious fundamentalism has gone mainstream, and its toll on education, science, and social progress is disheartening. Wake up, people. We are smart enough to kill our invisible gods and oppressive beliefs. It is the responsibility of the educated to educate the uneducated, lest we fall prey to the tyranny of ignorance." So there speaks a new atheist, one of the so-called brights, who adopt, as they say, a naturalistic worldview, free of supernatural and mystical elements, and whose ethics are based on that naturalistic worldview. The new atheists see the growing influence of religion as an attack on reason and science, and are bitterly denunciatory of the respect that some societies show for religion, although I must confess that their manner of reacting to it is remarkably similar to the attitudes of the extremists that they themselves despise. Now, the intellectual force behind the movement in the English-speaking world is undoubtedly that of Dawkins. And his recent bestseller, The God Delusion, is a no-holds-barred attack on the religious faith in general and the Christian faith in particular. He is no longer content with arguing against the existence of God. The new atheists are involved in an all-out attack on respect for belief in God itself. Now, it's important for me to make clear that although the new atheists and I are poles apart in our worldviews, we do agree on some issues. Firstly, the new atheists are not postmodern. They do claim to believe in truth. They reject cultural relativism. As Sam Harris says, either the Bible is the Word of God or it isn't. Either Christ is divine or he wasn't. So they're not postmodern. Peace be to people that thought that postmodernism is the only attitude that exists in society. Secondly, the scientists among them have a passion for the wonders of the natural world. I share that. A passion for science and its commitments to basing beliefs on evidence. Thirdly, they believe, or rather the God they don't believe in, is at least a supernatural being who exists and is involved in the creation and maintenance of the universe. I do believe in such a God. I mention that because Dawkins is careful to distinguish God from the God of Einstein or the physicists, where the word is essentially used for the laws of nature or for some vague kind of deistic creator who started the universe off and then retired. And the final point that I'd like to mention is the new atheists are horrified of religion that leads to violence and war. I share that. And I have reasons for sharing that view. So then, let me come to the central issues. And all I can do this afternoon is to give you a kind of way through to introduce this debate and what the issues are. In California in 2006, there was a conference at the Salk Institute for Biological Sciences entitled Beyond Belief, Science, Religion, Reason and Survival. And there were three basic questions before that conference. One, should science do away with religion? Two, what would science put in religion's place? And three, can we be good without God? And the opening speaker, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg, said, "The world needs to wake up from the long nightmare of religion. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done, and may in fact be our greatest contribution to civilization." Now, this attack on religion, they claim, was started by 9/11. And the logic is simply this. 9/11 is religion. It is a step too far. So we must abolish religion. If it is objected that this is extremist religion, they will say yes, but extremist religion thrives on the periphery of moderate religion. Therefore, all religion must go. How are we going to eliminate religion? By the cultural authority of science. But that may leave a problem, because traditionally, religion in the West has been the base for morality. What happens with the moral vacuum that will inevitably ensue when religion is abolished by using science? And they say that isn't really a problem, because ethics does not need God. We can have an ethics that is based on nature and society, or a mixture of both. So that's the basic logic, and everything else revolves around that. And I want simply now to take some of the major points briefly and then open up for questions. First of all, the title of Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, indicates that the chief complaint he and others have about religion in general and Christianity in particular is that faith is a delusion. It involves a delusion because faith is itself irrational, in that it is not based on any kind of evidence. And so it leads to statements like this. Dawkins says atheists have no faith, which is a very odd sort of thing to say. Hitchens, even more so. Our beliefs are not a belief. Well, I think an elementary course in logic would give you difficulty with that. But it is very important, gentlemen, that we are clear ourselves as to what the Christian faith involves. Because on the one hand, the new atheists are saying that faith is a religious concept. It's got nothing to do with evidence. It is sometimes sadly the case that Christians play along with that and say precisely the same thing. And of course, in the New Testament, it is very clear that faith is based on evidence. These things are written in order that you might believe. That is immensely important. It's why we got the New Testament. If we didn't need any evidence on the basis of which to believe, you wouldn't need the New Testament by definition, would you? And our belief is a response to evidence. Richard Dawkins insists that faith is blind, so I asked him if he believed in his wife in one of my debates with him, and he immediately said, well, of course I trust my wife, because there are those little things that a husband observes on the basis of which his trust can be based. So I said, oh, you do believe in evidence-based faith then? Oh, but that's not faith. But it was too late. You see, we all believe in evidence-based faith. Trust in society is something that we only give to people, if we've any sense at all, or institutions if there's evidence for it. But we're going to have to fight very hard to make that extremely clear. Now, I'm a mathematician, and of course people say, well, I won't believe in God unless you prove it. Well, you never believe in anything if you want proof in the mathematical sense, because you'll only get it in mathematics. We don't talk about proof in the strict sense. We may talk about it in a popular sense, but we can talk about evidence, pointers, a basis, something that's strong enough to commit ourselves to. I cannot prove mathematically to you that my wife loves me, but I'd stake my life on it. And I think you understand exactly what I'm saying. The evidence is strong, it's cumulative. So one of the things we have to do against this barrage is to be very clear on what the New Testament is talking about. There is a basis for trust. And preaching that basis, of course, lies at the heart of the New Testament gospel, centered around the death and resurrection of the Lord Jesus. Secondly, faith is not the exclusive, not exclusively to be found in Christianity. All scientists believe that the universe is rationally intelligible. So that the heart of science is faith, and Einstein said he couldn't imagine a scientist without faith. That's very important, because when you come to ask on what basis do scientists have this faith, materialism has no explanation, because it tells me that my mind is my brain. Since there's no transcendence, the mind is the brain, and the brain is the product of an unguided, mindless process. Well, then why should I believe anything it produces? Pretty logical, isn't it? And my chief complaint of the new atheism here is that it undermines the rationality on the basis of which we do our science. That's immensely important, because you see, Christian theism gives you a basis for doing science, because it tells you the reason that your mind in here can in part understand the universe out there is that God created both. And of course, historically, that was the cause of the rise of science in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, the second big issue is that religion is dangerous because of its consequences, violence and war. And the new atheists love to quote John Lennon's song, "Imagine a world with no religion, with no Taliban, with no Northern Ireland." Incidentally, I cannot imagine anybody who could imagine a world without Northern Ireland. But we do know what he means. There is an unacceptable face of religion, and we have to face it. And I want to tell you how I face it. I'm ashamed of it. Utterly ashamed of it. That the name of Christ ever became associated with violence and war. That's the first point to make. As in the Middle Ages, and as in certain parts of the world even in recent times. But the second thing to say is this, that people who use violence in the name of Christ are not following Christ, they are explicitly denying him. Because Christ himself was tried on the accusation of fomenting terrorism and political insurgency. He was hauled before the Roman procurator Pilate, who exonerated him publicly from the charge. When he discovered that the nature of Christ's kingdom was this, "My kingdom is not of this world." In what sense? Otherwise my servants would have been fighting, but they weren't. And once Pilate heard that, he knew that Jesus was not presenting a political threat. And the irony of the situation is this: the new atheists ought to be applauding Jesus for his stand against violence. And therefore, the next bit of work we're going to have to do is to explain to the world why the trial of Christ is so important. what the charges are, and how he was exonerated from them. Now, in this question of religion, the thing has two sides, but the new atheists only deal with one side. Now, John Lennon wrote a song called Imagine, but as you've noticed, I am not John Lennon, I am John Lennox. And I have another song. It's not called Imagine a World with No Religion, it's called Imagine a World with No Atheism. No Pol Pot, no Stalin, no Mao. What about that world? And here you will notice the strategy of the new atheists, and it runs like this. It's to put all the blame on religion in general and Christianity in particular. And it is also to exonerate atheism from any involvement in violence at all. So that Richard Dawkins can say that he cannot imagine an atheist who would bulldoze a cathedral like Chartres or Notre Dame. Well, he's right. They didn't use bulldozers because cathedrals are too big for bulldozers. Stalin used dynamite. And it is astonishing the sheer ignorance of 20th century history that is shown. Now that leads me to make a remark that I could spend a long time talking to you about. One of my major concerns about the new atheism is not simply their attitude to God, but it's their attitude to history, both the first century history and 20th century history. You see, in the world that I inhabit, the world of the academy, the number one rule of being a scholar is that when you're dealing with an opponent's case, you treat the best instance of their case. And you do your research thoroughly. What do I mean by that? Well, I'll illustrate it. I've just given you one illustration from the history of the 20th century. But in the new atheist writing, they express great skepticism about the historical existence of Jesus Christ. And in his book, Dawkins quotes a professor who puts up a scholarly case for the non-existence of Jesus Christ. But Dawkins doesn't tell us that he's a professor of German literature, not an ancient historian. And I did a bit of research, of course, and discovered that, as far as we can see, there's not a single leading ancient historian in the world who would question the historical existence of Jesus Christ. Now, this is a very serious matter. When people can be found out so very easily that they are not doing their fundamental research. In other words, not taking the Christian case seriously. I can work that backwards again, now that I've said it, into the matter of faith. You see, if you assume by definition, as they do, that faith is believing where there's no evidence, and then they come across you talking about faith, well, they assume that you believe without evidence, so they write you off. That's a very easy trick, isn't it? It bypasses the leading question is, are they right in their own definition? When, of course, they're not. So you need to be alert and have antennae to the new atheist attitude to history. They, of course, go to great lengths to exonerate Stalin and so on from any complicity, the atheism to have any complicity. And it seems to me, because I spent a lot of time in Stalin's world, that they just have no idea what Marxism taught. Because one of the great ironies, as I mentioned in my debate in Edinburgh with Christopher Hitchens, the topic was, the new Europe should prefer the new atheism. And my final point was, you're too late asking the question, because in 1989, the new Europe, which largely consists of the old Europe plus several of the communist states, rejected the new atheism because, of course, militant atheism, exactly what dominated them for 75 years in the form of Marxism, and they knocked the wall down. And I made the none too gentle suggestion it would be a bit silly to erect the wall again. So then, that's one or two points about that question. So what we're saying is, on the one hand, they attempt to exonerate atheism, and the other hand, they blame religion for everything. So it's a very unequal situation. Because, of course, you could apply their arguments, exonerating Stalin and so on, to the folk that they're against in the religious world that used weapons. The argument simply goes nowhere at all. The next point to observe is that in doing that, they say nothing positive about Christianity. And here they're very much at odds, not only with Christians, but with leading atheist thinkers. One of the most outstanding and interesting is Jürgen Habermas, who's probably the most famous German intellectual at the moment. Listen to what he says. He's an atheist. Christianity and nothing else is the ultimate foundation of liberty, conscience, human rights, and democracy, the benchmarks of Western civilization. To this end, we have no other option than Christianity. We continue to nourish ourselves from this source. Everything else is postmodern chatter. That is an immensely powerful quotation. And the irony is that the new atheists have the freedoms they do to express their views because of the Christian background to the constitutions of the countries in which they do their speaking and writing. And there was a very remarkable testimony in the London Times recently from an atheist. It went round the world, and it's worth looking up on the internet, by the columnist Matthew Paris. And he said this: as an atheist, I truly believe that Africa needs God. Missionaries, not aid money, are the solution to Africa's biggest problem. Now a confirmed atheist, I've become convinced of the enormous contribution that Christian evangelism makes in Africa, sharply distinct from the work of secular NGOs, government projects, and international aid efforts. And he goes on, and he ends up like this: removing evangelism, Christian evangelism, from the African equation may leave the continent at the mercy of a malign fusion of Nike, the witch doctor, the mobile phone, and the machete. That's a fascinating tribute by an atheist on what he's observed of the moral and social effect of the Christian gospel. And finally, on this religion causes violence question, is the other scholarly rule that is violated by the new atheists. The essence of any discipline, intellectual discipline, is the capacity to discriminate. They throw all religions into the same pot. But to describe the Taliban in the same terms as the Amish is to end any possibility of discussion. And I made the point, I think, to both Hitchens and Dawkins. I made the point that they are atheists and so is Stalin. Would they want me to discriminate between them and Stalin? Of course they would. And I would insist on discriminating. Well then, please, gentlemen, I said to them, do us the courtesy of doing the same thing. You have to make distinctions. Now that leads me to another vast subject. The fact that not all religions teach the same thing. In this pluralistic world, this is a thorny topic. But if you leave Christianity out of it, it's obvious that all the other religions don't teach the same thing anyway. And here again, we'll have to do some hard thinking in order to enable people to see clearly what Christian teaching is and what it is not. So then let's come, having looked at the question of faith briefly and the question of religion and violence briefly, to their solution. That is, science has already abolished God. Now this, of course, is a vast topic, but I'm only going to make one or two comments on it. Firstly, if you look at the front of Richard Dawkins' book, It has a most remarkable dedication to the memorial of Douglas Adams, the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And it goes like this: isn't it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it? Now, this is a classic example to be used in classes of logic for a very, very common error of logic, and that is the offering of false alternatives. What Dawkins is doing here is saying, look, you've two possibilities. You've either the garden on its own, or you've got the garden with fairies at the bottom of it. Those are the two possibilities. But I pointed out to him that that's a very odd thing for an Oxford Don to say, because both his college and my college have beautiful gardens. And the thing that distinguishes a garden from a wilderness is the activity of a gardener. And I pointed out and I said, Richard, you've done a great job at getting rid of the fairies, but you haven't got rid of the gardener. Far less the owner. But you see the point. And watch for it, because it'll happen again and again. I'm going to give you another illustration of it in a moment. False alternatives. Christopher Hitchens: thanks to the telescope and the microscope, religion no longer offers an explanation of anything important. Here again is a false alternative. And as a scientist, I find it impossible to take him seriously, as I told him. It's as if using a microscope on a Rembrandt painting could disprove the existence of Rembrandt. Because what they're saying here is this: you either take science or you take God. But why can't you have both? Richard Dawkins does exactly the same. It's either science or it's God. And I told him, I said, that is a very dangerous thing for a professor of the public understanding of science to teach, because some people just might prefer God if that's the choice you give them. And you'll be found to be anti-science. But of course it is nonsensical, because it is again a false alternative. But it's another kind of philosophical confusion. This time it's the confusion between mechanism and agency. It would be like my saying that because I understand and believe in the laws of internal combustion, I don't need to believe in Henry Ford. That's a nonsense. The laws of internal combustion explain how the Ford motor car works. Henry Ford is the ultimate explanation of why it exists in the first place. And what you'll find, a lot of the argument boils down to is this: we have a mechanism, it does X, Y, and Z, therefore there is no God. But that is logically a non sequitur. It's making what the philosophers call a category mistake. It's confusing mechanism with agency. That's extremely important. When Isaac Newton discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, marvelous, now I know how it works, I don't need God. He said, what a marvelous God he is who did it like that. And you see, we need to grasp that, gentlemen, because there is just a little danger sometimes of Christians adopting the same kind of thinking, that they use God to explain things that science can't explain. So there's less and less space for God. It becomes a God of the gaps, instead of saying, look, the more we understand of the sheer marvel of the universe and the way in which mathematics describes it, the more we worship the God who did it. Do you see that? The heavens declare the glory of God. It's a very subtle trap. Now, that matter of gaps is a sophisticated matter. And I'm going to have to leave you to my book where I deal with it in detail, because there are more subtleties than I can mention here. The next thing I'd like to mention is this: the conflict, they claim, is between science and religion. And you either choose science or God. I want to say no. I want to say there is a conflict, but it's not that. It's pretty obvious that science and belief in God are not in conflict, because belief in God was the motor that drove science in the first place. And the fact is that at the very highest level of science, let's take, for example, the Human Genome Project. Jim Watson, Nobel Prize winner, is an outspoken atheist. I've met him and discussed these things with him. The man who took over from him is Francis Collins, who's a publicly spoken believer in God. Now that shows you something. It shows you that the issue is not science versus religion. Bill Phillips, who won the Nobel Prize, a USA citizen, won the Nobel Prize for physics, a very keen evangelical Christian. The existence of such people gives the lie to the idea that science and Christianity are in essential conflict. No, no, the conflict is between two worldviews. Materialism or naturalism on the one side and theism on the other. There are scientists on both sides. So I made the point in my debate with Richard Dawkins, it's not science in that sense that divides us. It's worldview. Now what they claim, of course, is this, that science favors their worldview. And I want to argue the exact opposite, of course, that science points towards God, not away from him. So those are some of the issues that arise, but perhaps briefly, because these are the things that concern people, Richard Dawkins argues, and gives it a sort of scientific twist, that God is not probable. Well, of course, as a mathematician, my antennae rise up when I hear the word probable. But the question is beside the point, as I said to him, that he wasn't probable. I'm not probable. None of you are probable. Think of the probability of calculating whether you would exist or not. Working back. You see, the question is not, am I probable? What's the probability of my or God existing? The question is, am I actual? Is there evidence that I actually exist? Richard Dawkins is not probable, nor is John Lennox, but I hope there's some evidence that we exist. Do you get the point? That's number one. Secondly, number two, the argument that God cannot be an explanation for anything, because by definition, God is more complex than the thing you're explaining. Got it? You try to explain the universe, it's pretty complex. And you bring God in, well, God is more complex, so that's no explanation at all. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Well, let's take Dawkins again. I pick up a book called The God Delusion. It's about 400 pages long. It's quite complex. And then I discover its origin is Richard Dawkins, who's infinitely more complex than the book. So that's no explanation at all, is it? I mean, since I'm trying to explain his book, and I'm having to explain it with him, and he's more complex than the book, according to his argument, that's no explanation. There's something wrong there, isn't there? You see, he insists, of course, that everything goes from the simple to the complex. I would want to argue as a scientist, though it's a long argument, and again, I'll have to leave you to the book, that that's not quite the case. It's interesting, isn't it, that there are certain kinds of things which, when we see, we give them a very complex solution. You go down on the beach, you see your own initials written in the sand, 3 or 4 characters long. You immediately infer human intelligence, don't you? Just like that. And yet, we find that people can look at DNA with its codons. It codes for something. It's got a semiotic dimension. It's got meaning. 3.5 billion letters long, exactly in the right order, and they say, chance and necessity. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I find it interesting to drop that into coffee at an Oxford common room and watch what happens. Why is it that if a Chinese archaeologist sees a couple of scratches on a wall in a cave and recognizes them as a Chinese character, say the one that goes like that, which is run for a human being, immediately she'll say, human intelligence. She'll infer upwards because it's got a semiotic dimension. And yet DNA, which has got the same dimension, arguably, they attribute to chance and necessity. Something very strange is going on. But those are things that we would need to develop at great length, because I want to rapidly come to a conclusion. I think I ought to say something, though, about the question, who created the Creator? Because Dawkins thinks that that's the best argument in his book. Who created the Creator? If you claim that God created the universe, then you'll have to ask, who created God, will you? Let's logically analyze it, if it's not too soon after lunch. Logic is so important, folks, you know. If you ask the question, who created God, it shows by definition you're thinking of a created God, doesn't it? Who created God? Now, if Richard Dawkins had written a book called The Created Gods Delusion, I don't think he'd have made a lot of money, would he? Because it doesn't take him to tell us that created gods are a delusion. We call them idols, usually. The basic Christian claim is that God was not created. And if you insist on asking the question, who created God, it shows that you cannot conceive of the eternal. You need to think about that. But the second point is, when he raised this with me, I said to him, okay then, let's try your question on you. You believe that the universe created you. Well, tell me, who created your creator? Well, the same question, isn't it? He said, if you believe in God, you'll have to say, who created God? Well, he believes that the universe created him. Well, who created it then? But that's a different question. One of the things I've found very useful over my life is this. These arguments that seem so plausible, try applying them to the people that ask them and use them against you to their own theories. So I do not believe that science has abolished God, and there are many other reasons that I could adduce, but I just want to say a couple of things about matters of ethics. Now, this is again a very important topic. Do we need God to be good is often the way the question is formulated. You see, Christopher Hitchens tells us that the God he does not believe in is a tyrant and a bully. And Richard Dawkins uses long sentences telling us how awful God is. And what I observe to my great interest is all these things are moral statements about God. So I want to ask one or two questions now. On what basis are they making these statements? As somebody has put it, some wit, where is this mountain higher than Sinai that Hitchens and Dawkins are standing on to make their pronouncements? Now, this is a very important thing, because you see, they are claiming to take a moral high ground. And if you don't have a moral standard, of course you can't distinguish evil from its opposite. But if there is no eternal base for values that's external to humanity, how can Mr. Hitchens or anybody else's standards be anything but limited human conventions, ultimately meaningless products of a blind, unguided process? Indeed, it's a good question to ask how random mutations and blind selection can produce any morality at all, let alone the apparently invincible kind of morality that justifies the new atheist intolerance of religion. John Gray, a very perceptive intellectual, writes this: the new atheists defend liberal freedoms without asking where they come from. They are what is called soft atheists, in that what they want to do is to retain the moral values of a liberal Western democracy and atheism. But the real atheists, like Nietzsche and Camus and Sartre, would tell them that it is utterly impossible. And this is extremely important, because when you reject God, as Dostoevsky said long ago, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. He didn't mean, of course, that atheists can't behave well. We need to get that very clear. Every man and woman from the Christian perspective is made in the image of God and has a moral sense. Of course atheists can behave, and sometimes they put Christians to shame, actually, but that's another story. But the issue is there a basis for morality without God? And that is a very, very different question. Now, Richard Dawkins, on the one hand, judges the God of the Bible. Let us listen to what he says about the base for morality. I quote, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music." Think about it. The people that flew the jet planes into the Twin Towers were just dancing to the music of their DNA, as was Stalin, Pol Pot, and Mao. Or the shooter that shot the students in a university not too far from here not long ago. Just dancing to their DNA. That's the end of all morality. And one of the most important things we have to do is to show people where this is leading. There's a bus campaign in London at the moment on these long bendy buses that is part financed by Richard Dawkins. And there's a big advertisement on the buses and it goes like this: "There is probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life." Marvellous, putting the word "probably" in an advert, isn't it? This car will probably last you for a year. But apart from that, it's interesting, isn't it? They associate God with killjoy spirit. But if you remove God, you're in a prison, crushed in the end by the elements of the universe, as Dawkins has said. It would be good to ask where that bus is going before you got in, as I've mentioned to many people in the past. You see, how shall I put it? If you reject God as a source for morality and ethics, you'll have to find it inside the world. And it's a parallel problem to the problem in science, if you like, of rejecting God and saying, well, we've got to get life from non-life. We've got to get a universe from nothing. How is it done? I would want to argue it can't be done. The parallel thing in ethics is to get an ought from an is, to try and get it from underneath, from studying animal behavior. And the difficulty is with our society now, we're getting into total moral confusion because that's precisely what's happening. And so I think it's important to see those people who, unlike Dawkins, are taking the new atheism to its ethical consequence. One of them, of course, is the world's leading ethicist, and his name, as you know, is Peter Singer. And I quote again what he says, that the life of a newborn baby is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. If there is no God, you reduce human beings to animals, and they're no longer special. So we got a lot of hard thinking to do, because these influences are not occurring just over in a little corner. They're sweeping over the Western world like a wave. And I'm afraid it's going to involve a lot of work and a lot of being courageously prepared to get into the public space. I have been enormously encouraged by the way in which some of the records of the debates that we've already done have been used, by local Christians in their churches getting people together to watch them, and then the local church people answering the questions. I mention that because it's a practical way to get involved, because many people feel, I can't even begin. But you might, as a pastor of people in your church, you're scientifically trained, you can get them involved and give them a platform as to how to be involved. But anyway, I've said enough, so I'll stop. Thank you very much. Right. Please put your hand up if you've got a question, and a microphone will come to you. There's number 1. And you be looking out and bring the mic immediately to the next person. Yes, your question, sir.
Yes, sir. The question is basically, can you recommend a book or two on logic and logical thinking?
On logic. Recommend a book on logic. Okay. 2.
Over here. Jeez. What are your opinions concerning theistic evolution?
Theistic evolution. Okay. 3.
Is it on? Can you talk a little bit about, about Dawkins going into space aliens, as it were? Because I've heard him talking about how he believes that life may have come from Earth through space aliens as kind of getting away from intelligent design. Have you heard him talk to that?
Sorry, I can't hear what you're saying. I apologize.
Can you speak to Dawkins' fallback argument about intelligent design and space aliens and those kinds of things?
Oh, okay. ID and space aliens. Okay. All right. 4. Gets more and more interesting, doesn't it, you see, when you do it this way? Who's 4? Over here? Yes?
What are the best books that you've written to get introduced to your arguments? You've mentioned your arguments several times, how you get into more detail. What are the best books to get an intro?
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
5?
I saw Ben Stein's movie Expelled. Why isn't there more media and international or public platforms like that? We're driven by Hollywood and the news, and how can we win this war a little more strategically?
Thank you. 6?
Recently on a program called Wretched Radio, Christopher Hitchens had debated Todd Friel, and Todd Friel at the end basically asked him, listen, could the reason be that you don't want to believe in God would mean that you'd have to change your worldview in the fact that now you'd have to be accountable to someone else? And Richard Hitchens responded, well, yeah, exactly, you could sum it up that way. So my question for you is, do you think that's a valid way to approach this in terms of seeking to save the men's soul who obviously are rejecting God, not because of any logical proof, but because they don't want to be held accountable to a creator?
Thank you. 7? See, if I go on long enough collecting questions, I won't have to answer any. You realize that, don't you? 7, we'll stop at 7 and then we'll come back.
Yes, sir.
Yes?
Yes, sir. With regard to Christians and violence and war, when you take the Battle of Tours and Charles Martel and Islam coming into Europe, if your families and your children are endangered, is it still wrong to take up the sword to protect from a foreign religion coming in and taking over them?
Okay. Do we want to take 1 or 2 more, or will we stop there? 1 or 2 more. They want to hear what the questions are. It's always so helpful to have an idea of what's going on. Okay, let's take a couple more.
Alistair McGrath wrote a book on the twilight of atheism.
Yeah.
And then it seems like the new atheist came right after that. Did he miss that, or what happened?
Okay. 9?
Is there any evidence of the new atheists mobilizing political support to implement the things they want to see change in society?
Yep. Thanks, Ewan. Okay, 10. We'll stop at 10.
What are your thoughts on the mixing of church and politics?
I'm not an Irishman for nothing, you know. Okay, let's have a quick look at these. And it'll be brief. We'll have no time to come back because these things, any of them, could take up a whole afternoon. Can I recommend a book on logic? No. I can recommend what to do to solve the problem, though. Just go into any sensible bookstore and ask them. I don't know what the books you have here. And books on elementary logic are one thing, books on mathematical logic are another. But to get you thinking, one very useful book in this connection, that's not just a book on logic, is Del Ratch's book in IVP called The Limits of Science. And that's got quite a bit in it about logical thinking. I'm just going to pick these in different directions so that we'll get a little bit of a mix. Why is there not more media exposure? Well, I wish there were. And one of the reasons the media people tell me, let me speak for them for a moment, is the lack, they say, of articulate Christians who know how to speak in jargon-free language. And I think we're going to have to do a lot of work to learn to communicate in language that people can understand. Now, I'm speaking as a European. I'm not criticizing your culture because I haven't the right to. But what very easily happens in a situation where you've got large groups of Christians is the danger of spending most of your time with Christians, speaking an in-house language so that your ability to communicate with the world out there simply atrophies. And that, of course, silences you in the public space. We need to get into the public space. And we need to each ask ourselves how we can do that, how we can encourage the people involved in our churches to do that. It is very curious that the thing that we so easily forget is a little statement that occurs at the end of the book of Matthew, and it's go into all the churches. It isn't, is it? Go into all the world. And all you have to do is ask yourself, also as a pastor, what bit of the world are you in? That's immensely important because you cannot expect people in your congregation to be doing what you yourself are not doing. And that's why I said it's very important for me. I'm an academic. I spend a lot of time with mathematics and academic things. But I've got to be involved all the time because if I'm not, my ministry in terms of exposition of Scripture will be as flat as anything and irrelevant because I'll start answering questions that nobody's asking. The other side of the story is the domination of the media by materialism. It is quite astonishing what a bias there is because very often I will be invited on times onto a radio program, even a television program. But when they discover that I want to reason the thing out carefully and I'm not some extremist, they're not interested. Because what they want to pitch against Dawkins are soft targets. And so, again, it seems to me that it's important that we just get involved and use the materials we've got. Now, forgive the personal reference, but these DVDs are not meant for people to buy and look at in their homes. They're meant for people to use, to invite people in, to get a discussion going. And that's the way we can spread these notions, if at all possible. And there are many books, of course, and DVDs from all kinds of people in the United States and elsewhere to enable you to do that. But it is a difficult problem. In the press, it's exactly the same. So, again, we need to pray and we need to work very hard at it. Now, let me just take another question here. Yeah, Richard Dawkins' ID and space aliens. Of course, raising the question of intelligent design, it would take me an hour or two to begin to talk to you about that because, unfortunately, the words have been so politicized that they've become almost useless. The original idea of intelligent design, of course, is as ancient and respectable as science itself and the Bible itself. The driving force behind science was the belief that the universe has behind it an intelligent God. But unfortunately, the words have become manipulated. Now, I haven't time to explain to you what has happened, but leaving all that aside, the notion that there is a God who is a designer is absolutely central to the whole history of thought, and is not something to be banished by trivial remarks. That's the first thing I'd want to say. And it's very odd. I think you may be referring, when you mention little green men and aliens and all this kind of thing, to what happened after my debate in Oxford recently with Dawkins. Now, I don't know the ins and outs of them, but I think, and I'd want to check this, because it's important to get your facts right, something like Dawkins said he'd rather believe in little green men than he would in an intelligent designer. But the way to check that up, and some of you might be interested in this because it's a wonderful interchange. Dawkins has gone on the attack against me in Atlanta, and it's all on YouTube and so on, about things I'm supposed to have said. But there's a reporter who's a Jewish agnostic in England called Melanie Phillips. And she writes a column in The Spectator Online. And if you look up the last 3 weeks' contributions, you'll hear all about that particular thing because she has written about it. Now let me come to Christopher Hitchens and your question about being put to him, the reason that he might not like changing is that he would have to be accountable to God. Is that a valid issue to raise? Of course it's a value issue to raise. The issues at stake in this debate are not simply issues of reason, they're also issues of will and morality. And it is very important to realize that there are moral issues at stake. And we have to be sensitive to distinguish the two. One extreme is to say all the issues are moral, nobody ever had a genuine intellectual problem. That's nonsense. We must take people's intellectual problems seriously. The Lord did. The other is to go to the opposite extreme and say all the problems are intellectual problems. There are no moral problems. And it is a sensitive person who will raise at times, look, suppose I were to give you evidence that convinced you that Jesus was the Son of God, would you be prepared to obey him? And you'll get the answer sometimes, but that's just what I'm not prepared to do. I talked to a leading scientist just recently, and this question came up. And he explicitly said, no, I am not prepared to do that. And then I gently point out, well, that makes it clear to both of us that your problem is not simply intellectual. And that's progress. If people begin to see that their problem has got a moral dimension. And you notice that the Lord did it with people raising their questions. He would gently bring up the moral issue. Okay. Christianity and violence and war and families and children in danger. That is a very, very complex subject. Because, and it's not a subject I would want to even begin to address here, particularly not in North America, without having spent about a week preparing it. Because there are so many caveats that are necessary. One extreme is to say that who knows what any of us would do in particular situations. Now, I worded myself very carefully. I said that our Lord, or what I would have said if I'd taken longer to say it, is this, and I'm now going to say it very carefully. Our Lord forbade his followers to protect him or his message by using violence. That is very clear. Now, when it comes to the use of the sword by the state, Christians historically have gone in different directions, as you very well know. And that is a very big debate in its own right, and I'm not intending to, and I'm not going to raise it, because the only way of having that is as a debate where both sides of it are carefully presented publicly, because equally godly Christians have been divided on it, and you will know that if you know your C.S. Lewis. So I'll have to leave it there. On the one hand, you have Paul stating explicitly that the state does not bear the sword in vain, and John telling soldiers to be content with their wages, and so on. So there's a multiplicity of factors. The point I'm making is a point that needs to remain distinct from your question, actually, so that's why I'm glad you asked it. It's what is Christ's stance with regard to himself and the gospel? And we need to address that one first, because the reputation of the gospel. Let me just add a little thing. I can tell you what you will do if you use a sword to protect Christ and the gospel. You'll cut the ears off people. I hope you know your New Testaments well enough to know what I'm talking about. And that is in more ways than one. The reason the new atheists, one of the reasons they won't listen to the gospel is their ears have been completely cut off by this. That's worth thinking about, isn't it? What does Christ do? He puts the ear back on. We've got to do a lot of work putting ears back on, don't we? Okay, well, we'll have to leave that a hopeless answer to the question, but we'll move on. What do I think about theistic evolution? Well, my short answer to that is, it really is a shameless advertisement. But it's precisely because of questions like this that I was forced to write a book. So all I can do is force you to read it. The trouble is that the word evolution covers a whole spectrum of ideas. I could talk about the evolution of the South American coastline. You wouldn't bat an eyelid. I could talk about the evolution of the Chrysler motor car. You wouldn't bat an eyelid. But the two are very different, aren't they? In one, the process is caused by wind and random motion of the oceans and so on. In the other, by design engineering. And because of the confusion, that's why I wrote a book. But let me tell you two things. One, whatever you think about evolution, I would want to argue that you cannot deduce atheism from it, whatever you think of it. On the argument I just gave you, here's a mechanism, mutation and natural selection. It does something. It clearly does something. Just look around this room. Do we all look the same? No. Did you do any selecting in your life, you men? Select a wife? And that determined what your kids look like? And unfortunately, about a third of us in this room have mutations from which we'll die. So mutation and natural selection do something. Now just suppose for a moment, as a matter of argument, they did everything. Here's a mechanism that does something. Is that an argument that there's no designer who designed it? No. Now to be perfectly open with you, I am not convinced as a scientist that the mechanism of selection mutation which does something can bear the weight that Dawkins and company put on it. You see, the problem is very much complicated by this consideration. If you are a materialist, evolution is the only logical possibility. Matter and energy, with the laws of nature, wherever they came from, and that's a big question, must be capable, bottom up, of producing everything. That's the only logical possibility. Which is why theories of evolution predated Darwin, not by hundreds of years, but by thousands of years. And I recommend people to read Lucretius's book, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of the physical universe, if you can't read it in Latin, to see just how much he got. Or Ben Weikert's book, Moral Darwinism, which discusses the same issue. But as a mathematician, I have grave difficulty with the notion that mutation and natural selection can do what is claimed of them. And that is what I argue in my book. And it seems to me that from a Christian perspective, what the Bible claims in the beginning was the Word, and God said, and God said, and God said, is the exact opposite of an unguided, mindless process. It's a guided mind with inputs from outside the system. But that will have to do. I leave you to the literature for the rest of it. Now let's see. What have we got here? Alistair McGrath wrote a book called Twilight of Atheism. That is absolutely right, he did. And Alistair's book's a very interesting book because it raises a question. In my mind, I don't think I'd have the wisdom or the knowledge of the trends in thinking to really comment on his thesis at its main points. But what I find very interesting is this. The new atheism has become very, very militant, number one. Number two, it's relying on arguments that you wouldn't give a gamma minus to a first-year student in a philosophy class for. It's become intellectually trivial. Now, I emphasize that. I gave a couple of lectures in Salzburg University just a few months ago in Austria. And the professor, the head of the institute, came over to me and he said, "You mentioned Dawkins." And I said, "That's right." He said, "Why on earth did you mention Dawkins in your lecture?" I said, "Would you not have?" "Not at all," he said. I said, "Why not?" Because he said, "We're not interested in the intellectually trivial." Now, that was very interesting. So I smiled and said, "Well," I said, "you know, I notice in a country that believes it's intellectually trivial, his books sell in millions." And I mention him, not because of the intellectual level of the argument, but because of its influence in the public. And he said, "I'll accept that as an answer." But this is the kind of attitude you're getting. And many of my atheist friends in Oxford will say, "John, please, don't confuse me with that." They do not like this strident militancy. And Dawkins is explicit. I watched him say it in Atlanta or somewhere just the other day. "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't recommend atheism to you. I recommend militant atheism." And that leads me to another question, you see. And the question was, I find it a very interesting question. Not sure what the answer is to it. And that is the question of the political power of the new atheists. I find myself asking the question what they would do if they were in power. Because, of course, there are some very sinister suggestions being made. One of them is, not to put too fine a point on it, that teaching Christianity to your children is a form of child abuse. Now, I did say in one of my debates that that is very dangerous language. Because in most of our Western societies, child abuse is a crime, punishable by prison. And there are just little indicators in some of these books that would certainly disturb me to think of what might happen if these people gained power. Now, the question may mean, do they want power? And somebody the other day, I can't remember who, but a leading scientist said that is exactly what is wanted, is power. And so that's all I can say about it. It's logical, you see. If you put yourself in their position and they think we're deluded, we're deluding our children, we're anti-science, we're anti-intellectual, well, you don't want that. And Sam Harris is on record as saying some ideas are so dangerous that people might have to be killed for holding them. We've been there before, you know. We've been there before. And there are some very disturbing features about this whole thing, which is why I feel it's important to try to do something about it. And then somebody asked me about my thoughts on mixing church and politics. Well, you're the experts on it in America, aren't you? How could I dare as an Irishman to come? But from what I've said, I would just ask you to think about what history shows us and what it actually involves following Christ. Because there is a sense here again, like the previous question about armed service and so on, where Christians, thoughtful Christians, have come to different opinions. And I don't know your nation. I look at it from outside and I look at my own. But it seems to me that one of the tragedies is, well, two tragedies, and they're related. One of them is getting it into our heads that there somehow is an ideal form of political government that we have reached. You need to read the book of Daniel, I think, and chapter 2 to understand that political systems have different values. Some are better than others. But to make one of absolute value and to deem it Christian can be a very dangerous thing. It's a bit like denominationalism, isn't it? And my concern is for the gospel. And so the question I would ask back in this whole kind of context, just in my own situation, is this. Is what I'm doing and the action I'm taking making clear what the gospel is, or is it muddying it? And that's a question worth asking, whatever view you have in this topic. But again, it's a subject for a conference. It's not a subject for a question. Right, well, I've stroked through all these questions, so we've got 5 minutes. Any more? There's one there, two. Oh, I thought I'd mentioned my own book. No. The point is, pick up any book because they're full of references. And I'm going to say something in answer to your question that I've said to one or two people privately. Some of you may be meeting these ideas for the first time. And you'll have people in your congregations that are meeting them for the first time. Now, often people will come to me and say, where do I start? You've been thinking about this for 50 years, which is literally the case. Here am I, and I'm in college, or and I like to talk to my friends. Now, here's what I suggest they do. They talk to their friends. They keep asking them questions. I mentioned asking questions yesterday. I didn't finish my talk yesterday. If I'd gone on a little bit further, I would have said one of the best ways to get engaged is to keep asking a person questions until they ask you one. It's dead simple. Have you ever tried it? Well, often what happens is we're so full of answers we don't wait until they ask us a question. So I will keep asking people questions about their family, about their work, about anything until they ask me one. And so it'll go on. That's number one. Number two, you then take that question, and if you can't answer it, you find a book or a friend that can. And that'll get you going. Because one of the dangers in this whole area is to surround yourself by 50 books and say, right, I'm going to start, I'm going to get to know moral philosophy, science and religion, I'm going to study the works of the great, and you just get overwhelmed with it. It's far better to start and encourage your congregations. Now here's another thing. Many of you will have highly educated people in your congregations who are desperate to get involved. Now here's my suggestion, very simple suggestion, but many people will testify that it works. I say to people, you are an engineer, right? Suppose you had 15 minutes to talk to your colleagues about how your faith interacts with your thinking in your life. What would you say to them? I don't know. Okay, go home and work it out. Then share it with your wife if she listened to you, or your husband. Then get a few more people to share it with, and you work on one single talk, just one. Do you know, when you've done that, maybe you as a pastor will get that person to do it with a few people in the youth group. And maybe somebody will say, do you know, that was very good. Well, get them to do it with the adult class. And then that one talk will become 2, which will become 4, which will become 8, and it will all arise out of a living situation. The great danger of hearing talks like the one I've just given is to surround yourself with books and isolate yourself in a study. I want you to encourage you to do the exact opposite. Now, some of you as pastors, you won't be into this. You'll feel, look, it's too late in life for me to get into all these kind of things. That doesn't matter. If you've got people in your congregation that you can encourage, you can encourage them to get on with it and do it in your church for you. And then you'll have more people taking responsibility. Does that make sense to you? Start small and engage and let it flow out. And as I say, most books will have dozens of references, and you'll soon begin to find your way. But it's important to find your own way, because the things that will be most meaningful to you will be the answers to the questions you had difficulty with, not the things you've just learned by rote. You know for that from school, that you remember the things that you had real difficulty with. Why don't we bring that back into our Christianity? Okay. Was there another question? Right.
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Are there any other professors like yourself in prominent schools like the one you teach that hold these similar values? It seems like a dying breed. It's kind of depressing.
I'm doing my best to reproduce it, you know, by encouraging you people to get involved. I think there are more people than you think that are doing this. And it's good to encourage them. I mean, you mentioned Alistair McGrath, who was until recently a professor at Oxford, now a professor at London. Alvin Plantinga here is a world-class philosopher and a Christian philosopher whose reputation in Oxford is second to none, for example, my colleagues tell me. And there are people around, and it would be invidious to go through names. But we need to encourage our young people not to abandon science. And that could lead me into another discussion. We talk very glibly about full-time Christian work, gentlemen. I'm in full-time Christian work. And part of it is doing mathematics, part of it's doing philosophy. We must never give people the impression that there are two sorts of Christians. Now, I know you know all this, but it's so important, it seems to me today, that we encourage our best minds. God will call some to be pastors in churches. Thank God for them. He won't call everybody. But if you give people the impression that it's a second-class calling not to go into the pastorate, it's a very dangerous thing to do. Very dangerous thing to do.